This incredible event turned history upside down, influenced the course of the war, and launched the development of an entire science. One night, a small Cossack army was attacked by a horde of Tatars. A moment later, the Tatars fled the battlefield in fear. Hellfire was falling on them from the sky. Everyone decided the end of the world has come. In fact, in that battle, the Cossacks used a new secret weapon for the first time in history. 4 centuries have passed, and thanks to it, a man flew into space for the first time. How did a rocket turn from an ordinary gunpowder tube into a means of conquering the universe? Who were the people who made spaceflight possible, and what did they sacrifice for it? Zasidko, Kibalchich, Kondratyuk, Korolev. They solved the mystery of flights into space, but they paid a terrible price for it. Zasidko understood how to fly to the moon, but a sudden death awaited him. Kibalchich drew a diagram of the first spacecraft, and immediately afterwards he was hanged. Kondratyuk developed the trajectory of the spacecraft landing on the moon. Soon after, he went missing. Korolev launched the world's first rocket into space and then died suddenly on the operating table. All of them passed away in the prime of their lives. We will find out why their fates turned out so tragically. We will also find out how this crazy dream to reach the moon began.
Their secret knowledge caused fear because they knew something that others did not. Everyone passed on their discoveries to their successors. And so it went on for almost 5 centuries. And all because in the 16th century there were people who proclaimed that they could reach the moon. This is almost 400,000 kilometers. Isn't it an ambitious project? And these people were Zaporozhian Cossacks.
Year 1515, the Cossack army led by Hetman Bohdan Ruzhinsky was suddenly surrounded by the Tatars. The attackers are confident of victory because the Cossacks are twice as few. But suddenly the Tatars throw down their weapons and run away because hellish flames are flying at them from the sky. The Tatars decided that the devil himself was on the side of the Cossacks. They tried to read special orders from the evil one. It did not help. The Cossacks' magic weapon decided the fate of the entire war, and the Tatars retreated. What kind of weapon was it? The recipe for its manufacture has long remained a mystery. The Cossacks themselves called these deadly shells flyers. It was these Cossack flyers that the Tatars and Turks were afraid of like the devil. They were sure that the flyers had a magical origin.
Here you have something so terrible falling in the sky. Besides, one of them is producing something in the sky. Accordingly, a person is afraid. They explained that there were a lot of fortune tellers there who were performing magic, stopping cannonballs in midair, like the Baron Munchausen effect.
In reality, these devices worked more like a psychological weapon. Their main task was to frighten. But where did the Cossacks get such a weapon, and how did it work? To understand this, we recreated the look of ancient Cossack rockets. 5 or 6 bags of gunpowder were placed in a special sleeve. Then the sleeve was fitted to a special installation that resembled a large stationary bow and set on fire. This missile could cover a huge distance of more than 200 meters at the time. During the flight, it exploded as many times as there were bags of gunpowder in it. And the effect of these explosions was impressive. It was the Cossacks who called them flyers or flying fire. Nothing like that was used in battle then. That is why the enemies were really afraid of this Cossack fire. It remains a mystery who was the first Cossack to invent the idea of frightening enemies with this fire. One thing is for sure, these weapons came to the Cossacks from the east. The Chinese were the first to use such devices in the 3rd millennium BC. Then the Arabs began to use them, and from the Arabs, this psychological weapon came to the Cossacks.
I don't think that any scheme was brought to Zaporizhia and shown, but someone saw something. There were Cossacks in Iran. We already know this for sure. As mercenaries and in the embassy, they saw such devices, because in the East they were very common. Then they brought them here and used them.
It was the flyers that served the Cossacks to scare away enemies for a long time. Gradually, legends began to be made about them. Here is one of them. It is worth wanting, and a real Cossack can reach the moon on such a rocket. The Cossacks invented this story to further intimidate their enemies. And gradually their jokes got into fairy tales. People began to tell how one Cossack flew to the moon, another one flew on a devil all the way to St. Petersburg.
Fairy tales have such moments. Was there a real plan? I think it's unlikely, because they had enough of their own worries on Earth. It was a simple time. People were believers. And in general, it was quite easy to make the enemy believe that you possessed some kind of magic, some kind of secret alchemy.
The Cossacks were no more. The Sich disappeared. For a long time, no one has used mythical flyers. But one day, a little boy from the Poltava region heard a fairy tale about a Cossack who reached the moon. He heard and believed in her forever. Since then, he has devoted his entire life to unraveling that Cossack mystery. His name is Alexander Zasidko.
A descendant of the Cossacks will improve the Cossack flyers. He will restore lost knowledge. But in his old age, he will be considered insane and laughed at. What fantastic idea of Zasidko's will change his life forever? First make him famous, then make him abandon everything for the sake of crazy experiments. In the year 1813, captain of the Russian army Alexander Zasidko finally saw a real Cossack flyer. This happened in France during the war with Napoleon. It was made for fun by a descendant of one of the Zaporizhia Cossacks. The captain saw the device and was disappointed. The flyer that he dreamed of as a child had a very primitive design. It was an ordinary shell, which was used to shoot from a bow, and for many years he considered it an invincible weapon. A few months later, at the Battle of Leipzig, Alexander Zasidko saw another weapon. The British, the allies of the Russian army, used Engineer Congrave's rockets in the battle. They were powerful and dangerous, able to cover a distance of 1 kilometer. Here it is, his perfect flyer. It was then that Zasidko decided to improve the Cossack invention, to make the airplanes far ahead of the British missiles. He wanted them to be so powerful that they could even reach the moon. He came back from the war, sold his parents' estate, and used the proceeds to start an amazing experiment. For 2 years, Zasidko hardly saw his family. He gradually abandoned his military career. His former friends had already given up on him. But 2 years later, he presented his invention to the emperor. It was a unique rocket. It had a brass case and was loaded with gunpowder. It had a record-breaking range of almost 3 kilometers at the time.
This is a real copy of Zasidko's rocket. The Russian Empire had never seen such a weapon before. It was Zasidko's missiles that helped Russia win the Turkish War in 1828. With 2 volleys, several such rockets expelled the Turks from the Braille fortress. Later, Zasidko's missiles were used to take Varna. This was the end of the Russian-Turkish War.
In addition to the rocket, Zasidko also invented a device that could be used to launch a volley of 6 rockets at once. He also designed a device for guiding them. Many years would pass, and Zasidko's improved missiles would appear in World War II. These will be the legendary Katyushas. The prospects of these missiles were realized back in the 19th century. Thus, after successful tests, Zasidko's missiles were adopted by the Russian army. And the inventor himself was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general. But after a successful test of his missiles, Zasidko suddenly resigned. What's the matter? No one understands what he is up to. But Zasidko already knew that he would create another super-powerful rocket, and it would fly to the moon.
Zasidko's main idea was not to kill people at the expense of these devices. There was some higher goal that pulled him into space, up there. There is no need to prove this. It has been known for a long time. Accordingly, if he believed that he could somehow reach the universe with the help of powder rockets, then what was he wrong about this? What does it mean to be wrong? He pulled out everything that could be pulled out of the gunpowder's capabilities.
But what was Zasidko's mistake? He planned to launch his rocket to the moon from a huge cannon. But after the calculations, failure awaited him. Zasidko discovered that the launch required so much gunpowder that the rocket simply could not take off under its weight. Then he began to look for a substitute for gunpowder and found such a fuel. It was oil. But he didn't have time to build a cannon to fire a rocket to the moon. He died of a heart attack.
But his dream did not disappear. 30 years have passed since Zasidko's death, and the world has seen a new novel by Jules Verne. It was called From the Earth to the Moon. In the novel, a rocket flew to the moon. It was launched from a huge cannon, just like the one designed by Alexander Zasidko in his drawings.
Was it a coincidence, or did Jules Verne consciously use Zasidko's ideas? It is not known. Immediately after the book's publication, scientists declared this method of reaching the moon utopian. But the adventures of 3 cosmonauts, who did reach the moon with the help of a cannon, excited many future inventors.
What is the moon next to us? By cosmic standards, it is 384 kilometers, thousands of kilometers, and this is nothing. 3 days of flying to get there, 3 days back, and 2 days on the moon. It's nothing.
And when Jules Verne's novel fell into the hands of a boy from the Chernihiv region, it was he who managed to solve the cosmic puzzle that Zasidko could not. He was the first to realize how a rocket could take off with a person on board. This inventor was called an evil genius and a devil by his contemporaries because he was a terrorist and dreamed of killing the Tsar. There were 3 people working in a cramped dungeon under Nevsky Prospect. 2 men served powders and liquids. A pale young man nicknamed Cylinder mixed them. Almost everyone experienced dizziness from exhausting work, cold, and insomnia. But only the Cylinder had no right to lose his vigilance, because he knew that if he made the slightest mistake, they would all be torn to pieces by a terrible explosion. The real name of the man nicknamed Cylinder was Mykola Kibalchich. He spent 2 years in prison before that. He served time for possession of illegal literature. And after his release, the Tsarist authorities permanently banned the medical student from completing his education. Now he will never become a certified doctor. Mykola was desperate, and it was at that moment that he received his first order. He was supposed to make a bomb. Friends from the Narodna Volya party knew that Kibalchich had been fond of science fiction since childhood, dreaming of building some strange rocket. He even said that someday a person will be able to reach the moon on such a rocket. But the terrorists, the Narodovoltsi, needed Kibalchich to implement a less utopian project. It's just that he was an excellent chemist. He independently studied the properties of explosives, experimented with nitroglycerin. He did everything so that one day his cosmic dream would become a reality. The Narodovoltsy simply used Kibalchich. The man who dreamed of space was convinced that his dream would come true, but not under the Tsarist regime. Thus, Mykola Kibalchich became a revolutionary and the main specialist in the manufacture of a bomb that was supposed to kill Tsar Alexander II.
In his infernal laboratory, Kibalchich produced 7 bombs. The terrorists used the first 6 unsuccessfully. 6 times they tried to kill Alexander II, and after another assassination attempt, several dozen passers-by accidentally died from Kibalchich's bomb. The inventor read about it in the newspaper and burst into tears. The work of his hands killed so many innocent people, despite the fact that he did not want to kill anyone. It turns out that he became a criminal against his will. At that moment, Mykola Kibalchich decided to commit suicide.
He approached the barrel of gunpowder holding a candle. In a moment, a terrible, deadly explosion was to take place. But at this time, his assistant entered the laboratory. He stopped Kibalchich. The Narodovoltsy urgently needed a new bomb. And this 7th deadly creation of his hands seemed to put an end to Kibalchich's dreams of flying into space. On the 1st of March, 1881, the explosion of the 7th bomb killed Tsar Alexander II. All those who participated in the preparation of the attempt were put behind bars, and among them was a man whom the newspapers of that time called the Devil. The man whose creation killed the Tsar was Mykola Kibalchich. There was a long process. All participants in the murder were sentenced to public execution. And then Mykola realized it was over. Now he will never be able to realize his idea. He will not build a rocket by which man can reach the moon. He had only 2 weeks before his execution to convey his idea to his contemporaries, and he managed. In 10 days, Kibalchich hands his lawyer the project of the air-floating device. It's only 5 pages and 2 pictures. But they will revolutionize science. Kibalchich waits for a response, but several days pass, and no resolution. Then he writes a request to the Minister of the Interior. He asks for a scientist to come to him so that he can explain the essence of his work to someone. But no one comes. Later, it would turn out that this work was simply added to Kibalchich's case without ever being shown to scholars. And the convict himself seems to understand this. The night before his execution, he wakes up, takes a piece of a button, and frantically draws a diagram on the wall. It was a diagram of the world's first steerable jet-powered spacecraft. Kibalchich's spacecraft looked like a platform with a hole in the center. A cylindrical explosive chamber was installed above this hole. Combustion in it took place thanks to 2 candles made of pressed gunpowder. During the flight, the astronaut was supposed to stay on the platform and monitor the operation of the combustion chamber. It was the combustion chamber that ensured the flight of the ship. According to Kibalchich's plan, the rocket was supposed to take off vertically, and then, once it was fixed at a certain altitude, move like a regular naval ship. In the last days before his execution, Kibalchich was only concerned about the fate of his brainchild. I believe in the feasibility of my idea, and this faith sustains me in my terrible situation. If my ideas are recognized as feasible after careful discussion by scientific experts, I will be happy and will meet death in peace. But the convict's last wish, to tell scientists about the rocket, was not fulfilled. The inventor was hanged, and his drawings were made public only in 1918. They had been in his personal file for over 40 years.
The case of the convicted Mykola Kibalchich was continued by an unknown guy from Poltava. In an ordinary school notebook, he made his own accurate calculations. However, he was called a swindler in his homeland. No one believed in his ideas, but the Americans did. And it was thanks to the drawings of a self-taught Soviet scientist that a man first set foot on the moon.
Keep watching. Who developed the idea of Kibalchich? What cosmic prophecies of Jules Verne amazed the world in the 20th century? And why did Sergei Korolev fail to launch a rocket to Mars? And we will also try to design and launch our own rocket into the sky, an exact copy of the ship Vostok, on which Yuri Gagarin flew around the Earth. 2 centuries ago, Captain Alexander Zasidko invented a way to send a rocket to the moon with a cannon shot. In 1865, a similar idea appears in Jules Verne's novel, From the Earth to the Moon. Another century passes, and Jules Verne's novel is recognized as prophetic. It was this novel that inspired the inventor Mykola Kibalchich to create the first ever space rocket with a jet engine. And after Kibalchich's death, his idea was developed by a student from Poltava, Yuri Kondratyuk. In an ordinary school notebook, for the first time in the history of mankind, he draws a diagram of stopping space rockets on celestial bodies. Half a century later, it was thanks to this scheme that the Americans would be able to make a triumphant landing on the surface of the moon. They will call the trajectory of their spacecraft to the moon the Kondratyuk route. But a paradox will arise. Student Yuri Kondratyuk will write his unique work after his death.
Archival documents show that Yuri Kondratyuk died of pulmonary tuberculosis at the age of 17. But then it turns out that he published his book, The Conquest of Interplanetary Space, after his death. How could this even happen? How could a dead person write and publish books?
He slept only 2 hours a night. Instead of a bed, he used a large sack on the floor, where he lay naked at any time of the year. He did not drink or smoke. In his free time, he read or drew, and he spent several hours a day in the cellar. Only the closest friends knew that it was hardening. This is part of the body's preparation for spaceflight. Because this man was sure that he would be able to fly to the moon. He had read Jules Verne's novels, knew about Zasidko's idea of a cannon, and had seen the schemes and drawings of the revolutionary Kibalchich, which were finally published in Soviet newspapers. But he was ahead of all inventors, because already at the age of 17, he independently developed the trajectory of a rocket to the moon. This man's name was Alexander Serhiy, but he was known to the world under another name, under which he was forced to hide all his life. Yuri Kondratyuk. It happened in 1918. It was then that the commander of the White Guard unit, Alexander Serhiy, fled the front and reached his family in Kiev. But soon the city was captured by the Bolsheviks. They killed everyone who had anything to do with the White Army. Therefore, Alexander's stepmother, in order to save her stepson, gets him fake documents. For a fabulous sum of money, she buys the passport of a deceased student named Yuri Kondratyuk. This reincarnation saves Alexander Serhiy from death, but in the future, it will have a fatal impact on his entire life. In order to keep the secret of his name change from being revealed, Sergei Kondratyuk is forced to move to the Kuban. There, he, an engineer, works as an ordinary mechanic at the construction of elevators. At night, he studies math, physics, chemistry, and biology in depth. And in 3 months, he wrote a unique book. It is called Conquest of Interplanetary Spaces. In it, a self-taught scientist fully calculates the flight of a ship to the moon. This is what Sergei Kondratyuk proposed in his book. A spaceship takes off from the Earth. It makes circles first around its orbit. Gradually, the radius of these circles increases. Approaching the moon, the ship switches to movement along its orbit. Sergei calls this movement pattern for the spacecraft a snail's path. Later, the Americans would call it the Kondratyuk star route. In orbit, a small ship separates from a large one and lands on the moon. Sergei finishes the manuscript and sends it to Moscow. But they are not going to print the book there, because its author, Serhiy Kondratyuk, according to the documents, does not even have a higher education. The inventor suffers from the inability to explain to scientists that he is not who he claims to be. And then Sergei printed his book at his own expense, but signed it with his fake name. Thus, The Conquest of Interplanetary Spaces becomes a book by Serhiy Kondratyuk.
He didn't live on Earth, he lived in space and did his own calculations. These calculations did not correspond to modern space technologies. He was above both that time and the people from whom he studied.
Surprisingly, the book, which later in the States would become a sensation in the Soviet Union, was simply not noticed by anyone. The scientists even laughed because it turned out that the author had no higher education, that he was self-taught, a mechanic at an elevator. And in 1933, this mechanic was put behind bars. He was let down by his own talent. At the beginning of the 30s, Serhiy Kondratyuk submitted a project for the construction of a wooden granary to a competition and won it. According to the ancient method of Siberian architects, Kondratyuk built a huge granary without a single nail. The fact is that there was a terrible shortage of nails in the Union at that time. And Kondratyuk invented a method of economical construction. But instead of approval, he received years in the camps. He was accused of sabotage for saving money. They say that without nails, the granary will soon collapse and destroy the state grain. For this, Kondratyuk was arrested and sent to Siberia, and the granary, which was supposed to collapse in a few months, stood still until the beginning of the 21st century. He served many years behind bars, and when he was released from the camp, he began to secretly prepare for a spaceflight again. He slept naked in the bag again. He trained, carefully noted down new ideas and calculations. And in 1941, he went to the front and disappeared. 20 years passed, and at the end of the 60s, rumors swept through the Union. Kondratyuk did not die at the front. He works for the Americans and prepares the Apollo spacecraft for launch.
These conversations about the fact that perhaps not only the notebooks got to America, but also this, I think, is not from fairy tales, because no traces of Kondratyuk were found near Moscow. That is, Kondratyuk simply went to check the connection and suddenly disappeared.
Such a hypothesis seems fantastic, but it was in the 60s that American scientists suddenly found a small book in the Library of Congress, The Conquest of Interplanetary Spaces. From where this book, published in a small edition in the Soviet Union, got to Washington, no one knew. And it was this book that made the space revolution and helped the Americans to carry out the first landing of a man on the moon.
In the Soviet Union, official Moscow, that is the official Soviet Union, believed that Kondratyuk worked there. Today, this topic has somehow faded away. And there are different opinions. And then in principle, everyone believed that it was all Kondratyuk. Chief designer.
It was Kondratyuk's ideas that the Americans used to fly to the moon, and thanks to him, they won the second round of the space race. But the order to overtake the Soviet Union in space was given by President Kennedy only after an event that shocked the world. In 1961, a man flew into space for the first time, and this breakthrough happened in the Soviet Union, not in America. Surprisingly, this became possible only thanks to the person who preceded Kondratyuk, and whose name in the Union was classified until his death.
The ideas of Zasidko, Kibalchich, and Kondratyuk were combined by Serhiy Korolyov from Zhytomyr. Only he managed to solve the riddle over which humanity puzzled for 5 centuries. It was he who realized the cherished dream of man to fly into space. But how did he do it?
1938. The Soviet Union continues the trial of the secret Trotskyist organization, GVRR. One of its leaders, Serhiy Korolev, is given 10 years of hard labor in Kolyma. But before that, the designer had an impeccable reputation and was never seen in anti-Soviet activities. So what's the matter? In fact, the GVRR had nothing to do with Trotsky. This abbreviation stands for Jet Propulsion Study Group. Its participants were engaged in a harmless business, dreaming of flying into space. The leader of the group, Serhiy Korolev, studied the works of Zasidko, Kibalchich, Kondratyuk, and Tsiolkovsky. And he also enthusiastically read Jules Verne's novels. Among these novels, he was particularly concerned with one, From the Earth to the Moon. Of course, there were a lot of technical errors in the piece, but there were things that Korolev remembered, and which later supporters of the writer would call prophetic. After all, in Jules Verne's novel, the rocket was tested on animals before flying to the moon. A cat and a squirrel were launched into space. And almost 100 years after the publication of Verne's novel, on August 20th, 1960, the whole world learned the names of the first dogs that visited space. Their names were Squirrel and Arrow. The novel also talked about breathing apparatus that resembled spacesuits, and the rocket itself, in Jules Verne's work, was made of aluminum. As if the writer could look into the future and see that the walls of modern spaceships are made of duralumin. But researchers will talk about all these parallels later. And only thanks to the fact that the father of cosmonautics, Serhiy Korolev, despite all the difficult circumstances and years of the camps, will still survive. In the 30s, Korolev and his friends dreamed of flying to Mars and tried to design their first rocket. It was then that the group of young designers was noticed by Mikhailo Tukhachevsky, Deputy People's Commissar for Military and Maritime Affairs. He gave the developers the task to temporarily forget about space and devote themselves to the creation of new weapons, i.e., rockets. But in 1938, Tukhachevsky was suddenly declared an enemy of the people. According to a fabricated denunciation, he is called the head of a secret Trotskyist organization, and soon he is shot. The NKVD represses everyone who was associated with him, and first of all, Serhiy Korolyov and rocket engine developer Valentin Hlushko.
The whole affair hung over Tukhachevsky, and since they were his closest collaborators, that is, Korolev and Glushko, therefore, on the denunciation of some secret employee, he was arrested.
It is clear that they were not enemies with each other, because they had no time for that. They were not interested in politics and ideology. They were fanatically devoted to their work, that is, to create these rockets, to go into space, to conquer, to leave their name for the history of mankind. That's what they were interested in.
However, both Korolev and Glushko were accused of sabotage. The sentence was 10 years of hard labor in Kolyma. It is not known whether the world would have heard the name Korolev if not for the atomic competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1945, the USA tested a new type of weapon, the atomic bomb. Stalin understands that the Soviet Union will lose the next war if it does not take a step in response. And only then they mention the prisoner Serhiy Korolev. He is released from the camp and given a new task: to create a missile that can travel the distance from the Soviet Union to America with a nuclear warhead on board. Korolev understands that such a rocket will be able not only to reach the USA, but also to ascend into space. And then, in 1954, he proposed his plan to the new General Secretary, Nikita Khrushchev. to launch an artificial satellite into Earth's orbit.
Khrushchev believed that such a project should be carried out, that an artificial Earth satellite with nuclear weapons should be launched so that it would hover over America and, if necessary, bomb America, so that Americans would be afraid all the time. They even wanted the internationally to be broadcast by this satellite all the time. They wanted to scare people.
In 1957, one by one, artificial satellites were launched into space. Soviet newspapers write that the era of space trains will soon come and whole cities will appear on the moon.
I remember when in 1957 the satellite of the Earth was launched for the first time. I remember how we boys were looking for these satellites in the night sky, among the stars. And how we rejoiced when we saw this satellite.
Our satellites are orbiting the Earth and waiting for the American and other satellites to appear next to them in order to establish friendship between satellites.
But for some reason, no one knows the name of the man who made spacewalking a reality. In the Soviet Union, the identity of the chief designer is still classified. And on April 12, 1961, the dream of all space explorers became a reality. On that day, the TASS news agency reported a stunning piece of news. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin made a flight into space. He flew around the Earth on the Vostok rocket. This is a small copy of the Vostok rocket. It was made by experts in rocket modeling, especially for our experiment. And now we will try to repeat the launch that shocked the world in 1961. We are advised by researcher and space historian Vladimir Panakno.
Unbelievably, not so long ago, these drawings were completely classified, and now they are available even to a schoolboy. Can you find the same drawings on the internet?
Yes, you can. And there are not only drawings available, but even ready-made scans that you can print out and assemble the model.
The basis of Korolyov's Vostok space rocket was the R-7 combat rocket. The rocket was as tall as a 16-story building, had a diameter of about 10 meters, and weighed more than a passenger train. The rocket consisted of 3 main stages. After the fuel was burned, the stages were successively separated from the main body of the rocket. Thus, at the end of the flight, the rocket was much lighter. The control of the Vostok ship was carried out automatically, although if desired, it could also be controlled by the cosmonaut himself. The cosmonaut's cabin was also a launch vehicle. When landing, the cabin separated from the main rocket and threw out a parachute. It was a sphere about 2 meters in diameter, protected by a heat-resistant material for safe entry into the atmosphere. Our rocket design is made of paper. Engines run on gunpowder, but like the real Vostok, our rocket consists of several stages. The stages should separate in the air when the rocket rises to a height of 100 meters. Final preparations, we put parachutes in the rocket, the so-called rescue system. Thanks to this system, all parts of the rocket will be able to return to Earth intact. After that, we mount the engines and put all the parts together. That's all.
Our rocket is ready and we are going to test it. Can I take it?
Yes?
Here is our spaceport. An ordinary field outside the city, away from people and power lines. Here we are setting up the launch pad. In order for the rocket to fly vertically, we attach it to a metal rod. Next, we connect the engine ignition system. Next, we deploy a remote control engine launch to launch the rocket from a safe distance. Everything seems to be ready. Final countdown.
Get ready to start. 3, 2, 1, start.
And start.
What a beauty. Here it is. Our launch was successful. Everything is like a real rocket. At altitude, the parts detach, and the astronaut returns to Earth by parachute.
The flight on April 12, 1961, was approximately the same. And dozens of other launches followed, which cosmonauts will remember for the rest of their lives.
But in fact, spaceflight is actually a lot of stress. This stress is present in literally everything, both from the point of view of physical perception and from the point of view of what is there, what a person encounters in space.
After Gagarin's flight into space, the Soviet Union triumphs. The country managed to overtake its biggest competitor, the United States, in the space race.
On May 25, 1961, Kennedy spoke and said that the American nation had lost everything. And it is not known which path of development peoples from all over the world will take, capitalist or socialist. Our successes were very attractive.
After Gagarin's landing, the Nobel Committee twice proposed to the Soviet Union to name the brilliant designer who made the dream of generations come true. But Nikita Khrushchev replied that flight into space was an achievement of the Soviet people. That is why ex-prisoner Serhiy Korolev never received the Nobel Prize. But the designer himself was not upset about this, it seems. Because after the landing of Vostok, he was going to implement the next grandiose project, to build a unique rocket for an expedition to Mars.
It seemed to everyone that the level of rocket technology was so high that a little more, so, and we would break through to Mars. And then Venus. The moon is close.
Korolev's new interplanetary ship had to have everything for a long flight of cosmonauts, because it would take 7 months to fly to Mars. Separate rooms for each of the crew, a medical station, a gym, showers, a library, and even an animal farm were planned on board. It was impossible to launch such a huge ship from Earth, so it was going to be assembled in Earth's orbit from ready-made parts of the modules. To transport these parts, the N-1 rocket was developed. There were no analogs to this rocket. N-1 weighed 2,000 tons and was as tall as a skyscraper. In 1965, the work was almost completed. All tests on Earth were successful. The N-1 rocket was ready for flight. But the unexpected happens, and Nikita Khrushchev orders Korolev to urgently redo N-1. He learned that the Americans were preparing to be the first to land on the moon. Now, in order to overtake them, Korolev's new rocket must launch a ship into orbit for a flight not to Mars, but to the moon. Sergei Korolev carries out Khrushchev's order, but he is not going to abandon his idea. During the day, he works on adapting the rocket for a flight to the moon, and at night, he continues calculations for an expedition to Mars. But the designer would not live to see the launch of his largest rocket, the N-1.
That day, Korolev had a basic operation on the intestine, removal of rectal polyps. The operation was supposed to last a quarter of an hour, but unexpectedly, just during the operation, the doctors discovered a tumor, which due to carelessness was not noticed during the examination. They suspected cancer and decided to urgently cut out part of the rectum. But under anesthesia, the patient began to choke. They tried to put a tube down his throat for ventilation, but they couldn't. During interrogations in 1938, Korolev's lower jaw was shattered, and now it could not be opened sufficiently. Sergei Korolev died on the operating table.
Korolev died at the age of 59, and immediately after his death, his name was finally declassified. Soviet propaganda turned Korolev into a lucky man, a man of legend. However, after the designer's death, no one managed to launch his last rocket. And in 1969, the competition between the two superpowers stopped. American astronauts visited the moon and won the space race, ahead of the Soviet Union. This happened thanks to Yuri Kondratyuk's developments and an exact coincidence with Jules Verne's novel. In the work From the Earth to the Moon, the fictional rocket was called Columbiad, and the main part of the American spacecraft, Apollo, was called Columbia. In the novel, 3 astronauts went to the moon. There were also 3 crew members on the historic Apollo flight. And finally, the ship in the novel started from Florida near Cape Canaveral, where 100 years after the fictional events in Jules Verne's book, the historic launch of the lunar spacecraft, Apollo, took place. So a big dream turned into a reality, and a small step of a person became a giant leap for all mankind. For 5 centuries, people have been looking for a way to travel into space and reach the moon. This idea was proclaimed by the Zaporizhzhia Cossacks to intimidate their enemies. And in the 18th century, General Alexander Zasidko believed in this fairy tale, and it was this idea that haunted all his successors, Kibalchich, Kondratyuk, and Korolev. Each of them contributed to the development of cosmonautics. The Soviet Union won the space race thanks to the ideas of designer Sergei Korolev. The United States took revenge and won the battle for the moon thanks to the developments of Soviet scientist Yuri Kondratyuk. And in the end, all the inventors did meet on the moon. Now, on the far side of the moon, there are the Zasidko, Korolev, Kibalchich, Kondratyuk, and Tsiolkovsky craters. Jules Verne's crater is also among the many names on the moon. The person who stirred the imagination of whole generations of dreamers with his novel, and thanks to whom the flight to the moon from a fairy tale became a reality.